looking at this lady and not you, should I look at the camera?
Up to you.
I think it's important to understand the limited sort of presence of the Institute of Landscape Architects back in 1968 when it was first formed. Mainly there were people, as I had said, had travelled and learned landscape to some extent overseas in America and the UK, and brought it back to Sydney with them. Mostly they were operating in government departments and things like that. Not too many of them were out there doing literally landscape work, as in projects, etc. And I was one of the few who were doing that. But to bear in mind, in 1968, I've made mention of the fact that the vocabulary of our society in those days had no idea, one, about landscape architecture, obviously, that had never been heard of, but they had no idea of words like environment. Environment didn't exist in 1968, in 1970. It didn't exist in our society's language. Didn't happen. Indigenous, not understood. Aboriginal background and their meaning, you know, to this land and its development and so on, never heard of, you know. And that was the scene. And in 50 years, all of those words and other words like it are commonplace in our normal language. It's wonderful. But 50 years ago, it really did not happen. It was unknown by most people except those who were installed in various forms of academia and such like. Now, 50 years later, fortunately the world has changed tremendously. It really has. And that's another delight for me to observe that that is the case. It is happening. And back to the year 1970 when I did the work at AILA Reserve, which at the time was called Peacock Point. That was the geography of the site, but later changed to AILA Reserve. There's an Aboriginal title for that, and it's can't think of it. It's in the book. But anyway, the main thing is we set out to do a job a little along the lines of just what I was just discussing, doing the job so that you're completely happy with the result, regardless of the fee. And at the end of it, I did everything that I needed. I related to the harbour environment, to the local Balmain environment, to the whole nature of landscape architecture, always installing Indigenous landscape material of the harbour. And we did that. At the end of it, we were all completely happy with what we'd done, but the one thing we didn't know was we were setting a new standard for landscape in Sydney, landscape in New South Wales, and for that matter, around Australia. And we had no idea that was happening. That was part of the brief I hadn't set out to achieve, because I didn't know it was going to be the case. But from that point on, from 1970 on, all landscape architects, eventually a lot of landscape contractors, and eventually local government councils around this state and to a large extent throughout Australia adopted the Indigenous landscape theme as their standard for their policies and expectations. And I see it everywhere. I see it in the streets here. Banksia trees, where there used to be plane trees, where there used to be liquid ambers and all that. Banksia trees and Indigenous plants going in everywhere. And it's a delight to see. Well, that's the outcome of doing the work AILA Reserve at Balmain. Had no idea this was going to happen, and the fact that it did turn out that way is probably the greatest thrill that I've ever enjoyed in my career, ever, to see that happen. When I mentioned the fact that I stopped becoming a sub-consultant, it was because I needed to be the landscape architect close to the client's brief, close to the budget, close to the policy, where they're heading and why they're doing it, instead of being somewhere down the line, being told by the architect, this is what's happening now, change that, do this, do that, and so on. And it didn't work for me. And although at that time I did work a lot for really good people, their homes and everything else and their friends, I eventually got to the point of saying, as much as I like doing that, I'm not going to do it anymore, you know? I've got to work for the broad environment, for large numbers of people in parks, in town centres, in suburbs, etc., including, for instance, Sydney Olympic Park, you know?
Yeah.
All of that was done, it's in the book, and it was a very valuable contribution. Well, I'd like to say to all of you people, male and female, that if you have anything like the experience that I had during my lifetime, you're going to be a very, very lucky landscape architect, because I've enjoyed it so much. Now, you know, there are disappointments, there are tragedies, there are things done well, things done badly. That's all part of life. You have to accept all of that. And each time you do something badly, you learn to do it better next time. And you're always learning to do it better next time. Your whole life, even now, working for national parks at West Head, my first job in the public arena was West Head. And that was nearly 60 years ago. And to a lot of people, I would say, were you alive then? Very often they weren't, of course not. But that's when I started work, and strangely enough, the work I did at West Head was unusually good. I can't believe it. I look at it and I think, how on earth did I do that? I had no real training, but everything was done along the lines that I've been talking about, you know, conscientiously. So we did put it together very well, and I was very pleased to see what I had done, and I was a bit surprised. And now, nearly 60 years later, I'm re-employed to do the job on the safety barriers. And I can't say that this is a winner at this stage. I can only say, I think I've got the client on side, but we've got to wait and see, okay? One thing I'd like to say is you pursue the brief until its correct conclusion, regardless of the cost. That's not a good position to put to people who are working for other people, and the boss might disagree, but you've got to talk your boss around to the extension because you haven't quite realised it, or you do it in your own time, not in the boss's time. But the main thing is, regardless of the fee, you establish the quality of the design that you're setting out to do until you are really satisfied it has been done. Okay? I'm so pleased to be offering this book that I produced in 2011 when it was published. I spent about 5 years putting it together, and out of the 5 years, 2 long hard years writing it and 2 long hard years rewriting it to try and get as successful as I could possibly make it. Now I would love to write it again, and that's the same with any book. You will always go back and say, oh, if only I could write this again. Anyway, this is what I'm offering the registered landscape architects as part of the important life that is ahead of you. And the work you do should be delightful, intriguing and satisfying for most of that time. There'll be a few tragedies along the way, but they are only ever learning experiences. Okay, that'll do.
Thanks, Bruce.